Worst PC build ever? And let me just start off this video by saying that this was going to be a how-to video, how to build a desktop PC from scratch, but this went so poorly, there's no way I could have used my footage for anything other than this is how bad it could go if you don't research enough on what hardware works well with other pieces of hardware that you're buying. It really came down to the case. See, I got this case, the Deepcool New Ark 90. It is a beautiful case. It is quiet. It works perfectly for what it's supposed to do. But when it comes to actually building in it, well, I just don't think I would buy it again for an AMD build. So immediately out of the gate, the issue that I ran into, first of all, was that the documentation, well, at first glance, there was no documentation. It wasn't in the box. When you pull the case out, what you have to do is you open the case, and then I've seen a lot of cases where hardware and documentation are in the case, kind of just in free fall or zip tied down. What they did is they put the documentation and the hardware in a 3.5-inch hard drive slot, which was screwed in and covered by the front plate. And there's no indication that tells you that, hey, if you're looking for the documentation and the hardware, that's where you go to get it. You just kind of have to find it on your own and then figure out that you're supposed to disassemble the case in order to get it. I mean, it was even screwed in. See, check it out. Now, nothing crazy has happened here. I've just removed the side panels, and I also had to remove the front panel from the very front side of the case. Now, here's why. This particular case does not come with documentation in the box. The documentation itself was actually in one of the drive bays, and you had to disassemble the front panel and the drive bay in order to get to the hardware as well as the documentation. Now, here's the big kicker. There's no documentation labeled anywhere indicating that that's what you have to do to get the documentation. You literally have to salvage and scrounge for it in order to figure out what your next step is. So I ended up doing that. I ended up disassembling these pieces just to find the documentation. But that's all I've done up to this point. But that wasn't even really the big gripe that I have with this. The big gripe that I have with it came down to the fact that this comes with a gigantic liquid cooler, an amazing liquid cooler, for Intel builds. So the tubes that actually feed the water to and from the pump, they're not long enough for an AMD motherboard, at least not the AM4 motherboard that I got. The ASUS Republic of Gamers Crosshair 8 Hero. That motherboard has the CPU kind of in the center of the motherboard. And I guess what you're really looking for if you're doing an AM4 build is you want RAM on either side, so it tries to get that CPU as close to the right as possible. Otherwise, you're going to run into an issue like I ran into. Watch this. Now, typically, after this, I would install the processor next. But I am suspecting, just a hunch, this RAM is really tall. I'm afraid about how this is going to be positioned. This is going to be positioned like this. And you can see what I'm worried about right here. Yes, right, yeah. Well, so I guess it's going to be more like that, isn't it? Nope, it'll have to be. Yeah, that's... literally the only way I can do this is like this, and that's not going to work. All right. Okay, here we go. This part's going to be tough. Whew. All right. Look at how tight these cables are. That's not nerve-wracking at all, right? But it's mounted. Whew. Man, I feel like I'm going to regret this later down the road. All right. But my problems didn't stop there. The USB 3.1 connector that comes from the case chassis and down onto the motherboard, the actual holes for that connector, the female end of those holes, had not been thoroughly punched through. So when I went to plug it into the motherboard, it actually bent the pins, and now I don't have any USB ports on my case that are functional because the pins on my motherboard are now bent. Because the pins are actually bent. All right. Not a great experience with my Deepcool case so far. But remember that whole saga of where I actually had to push the motherboard into place and pull those liquid cooler pump tubes as tight as they could possibly go in order to get the CPU into place? Well, it reared its head again when I went to mount the graphics card, and the graphics card was too big. You see, this case has a side slot where you can extend your PCI Express slot out and then mount the graphics card on its side. But the brackets that are in place to hold a graphics card on its side get in the way of mounting an RTX 2080. So what I had to do is I had to disassemble the motherboard out of the case, slot the graphics card in, and then put it back into place. But guess what? Then I had to fight the CPU all over again. So that I can actually put this graphics card in. And now I'll be able to slide it back into place. All the while fighting the CPU coolers pulling against me. Right? Remember that whole drama? God, this sucks. This really sucks. This is so hard. Jeez. Woo. So yes, at the end of the day, I do have a fully functioning computer that I am recording on right now and I'm editing on right now. This, you're watching it right now. What I'm using, that is this computer. But I don't know how long it's going to last. Like, I feel really, really anxious about these CPU cooler tubes being stretched to their very max in order to get this motherboard mounted in there. So, you know, if you're in the market for a case that has a liquid cooler applied to it or in it, if you're an Intel person, Deepcool New Ark 90, you won't get a better case. But if you're going the AMD route, if you're riding that Ryzen bandwagon like I did, well, you will want to research very carefully where the CPU placement is on the motherboard, because there's not a compatibility list that's going to work with this either. So rotating that CPU cooler 90 degrees is going to be a real stretch for you if you're going with just a standard motherboard, or especially if you're going with the ASUS Republic of Gamers like I did. So thanks everyone for checking this video out. If you liked what you saw, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. The subscribing is free and it goes a really, really long way for content creators like myself. Thanks again for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.